Hello and welcome to our webinar. My name is Alice Valvoda and I'm Head of Consult at RCS Global. Today's webinar will explore how companies are responding to increasing supply chain due diligence requirements, particularly the EU battery regulation, and the role of digital technologies and the battery passport in that process. For those of you who don't know RCS Global is an international advisory, audit and digital solutions firm. We our work focuses on responsible sourcing and supply chain mapping, responsible mining, ESG performance and traceability. Our clients include a range of companies from across the raw materials supply chain, including downstream automotive and electronics manufacturing companies, midstream processing, and also upstream mining companies. And we deliver our work through our various business units, which include our consult, mapping and auditing, digital solutions, and better mining business units. And today's webinar is actually a joint effort of the consult and digital solutions business unit, and hence I will be co-chairing the webinar with my colleague Dr. Ian Fraser, who heads our digital solutions business unit. RCS Global is working towards transparent value chains of raw materials that are demonstrably responsible. And this also includes our work to contribute to the Global Battery Passport initiative, and we'll hear about that later. And we're a global business, so we have offices located in North America, in Europe, in Asia, and also in Central Africa. And our work has been recognized in international media, such as the BBC and the Financial Times. And I shall now hand over to Ian to introduce the agenda and the speakers.
Thanks very much, Alice, and a warm welcome to all of our panelists and participants. I'm very excited to co-host and co-chair this webinar with Alice. As you can see, we've got a very full agenda, so all of our speakers will be doing their best to practice good time management. And then we look forward to an interactive panel discussion and question and answers session in the second half of the webinar. Before I move on to introducing our speakers briefly, I'd just like to draw your attention to some house rules. For today's webinar, you have all been muted. However, there is a question and answers function in the Zoom call that we would encourage you to make use of. And we will have it that those that are currently presenting and speaking have their cameras on, and otherwise we will be off camera. So next slide, please. My colleague Alice, Head of Consult from RCS Global, has already introduced herself. Here in the order of the speakers, I would just briefly like to introduce our excellent panel today. We have Eric Richter from Stellantis, who is Corporate Social Responsibility Correspondent, who will be giving us an industry perspective on responsible sourcing and the role of digital technologies. Then we have Dr. Thorsten Freund, Head of Project Management for the Battery Passport project of the Global Battery Alliance. Welcome, Thorsten. And we have Dr. Robert Pell, Founder and CEO of Minviro, talking to us about life cycle assessments and the importance of environmental and emissions data throughout battery supply chains. And finally, I will also be presenting in my role as Head of Digital Solutions from RCS Global Group. So with that, I would like to hand over to our first speaker. Eric, please take it away. Next slide, please.
Thank you. Oops.
Apologies, it's me actually. I'm the first speaker.
Sorry, yeah.
Sorry, Eric. So thank you, Ian. So my presentation will cover the EU battery regulation and sort of set the scene, and I will talk about how the EU battery regulation is impacting companies and what practical approaches and actions they can take to comply with it. So to set the context for today's webinar, over the past decade, there's been an emergence of due diligence regulation globally, and some of the due diligence laws are already in effect, and some are still in the process of being agreed. And over the past 10 years, at least 7 human rights due diligence laws were passed, and particularly over the last 5 years, due diligence regulation in Europe has been coming fast, and the EU is very much setting a global standard for what supply chain due diligence regulation should look like. And also it is impacting not just companies directly in scope, but also global companies in the supply chain that are being indirectly affected. And currently in the EU, there are multiple legislative processes that are ongoing, including the EU battery regulation. So the draft EU battery regulation aims to ensure a level playing field for the EU battery market, promote a circular economy, and reduce the social and environmental impacts at all stages of the battery life cycle. If you can just switch to the next slide, please. Thank you. It introduces requirements for 4 types of batteries: portable, automotive, industrial, and EV. And these requirements are selectively applied, and they also have different implementation timelines. So it's quite an ambitious and quite a complex piece of legislation, which will apply to economic operators that are placing the 4 types of batteries on the market. And this includes importers and downstream manufacturers, including automotive and battery manufacturing companies. There are 4 specific sets of requirements that I would like to bring to your attention as they relate to the content of today's webinar. So first of all, Article 39 covers responsible sourcing and requires that due diligence policies and processes be established for rechargeable industrial batteries and electric vehicle batteries that are placed on the market. Article 7 requires each electric vehicle and rechargeable industrial battery to include details on its carbon footprint, to be calculated according to a forthcoming commonly agreed methodology. Article 8 requires collecting recycled content information for industrial and electric vehicle batteries, and requires batteries to eventually include a minimum amount of recycled content. And then finally, Articles 64 and 65 lay down requirements to label batteries with a QR code that provides access to a battery product passport. And this will have information on the characteristics of the battery, but also details about supply chain due diligence, carbon footprint, and recycled content. And if you can go to the next slide, please. In terms of where we are with the draft regulation, so currently the 3 EU institutions, the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the Council of Ministers are engaged in trilogue negotiations on the text, and these are taking longer than expected. So it's unlikely that the regulation will be agreed before the end of this year, which means that it would come into force sometime in 2023. But as I mentioned before, the various requirements have different implementation deadlines. And there are still multiple components that are being discussed by the 3 institutions as concerns the supply chain due diligence requirements. So for example, the implementation timeline for the due diligence requirements, with the various institutions or the latest compromise text proposing 36 months in comparison to the original 12 months that was included in the European Commission text. How notifying authorities or notifying bodies will assess and confirm conformity, the material scope, with the European Parliament pushing for the inclusion of iron, bauxite and copper in the material scope, whether the supply chain due diligence requirements will apply to the supply chain or the entire battery value chain. The Council and the European Parliament are also proposing to broaden the scope of the environment and social requirements in the regulation. And there are also ongoing discussions on the recognition of supply chain due diligence schemes to achieve conformance. And the Parliament is also campaigning for including a liability regime for victims to access remedy. And if you can skip to the next slide, please. So in terms of the impact this is having on companies, so the regulation will obviously introduce ambitious, specific and measurable requirements, supply chain due diligence and ESG data collection in the supply chain. It will extend to more companies than just those that are directly in scope. So particularly upstream companies will also be impacted, even though they're not directly in scope. And as I mentioned before, the risk scope of the due diligence and risk assessment is also quite broad. And this will bring challenges such as the costs that are related to the implementation of the requirements. So for example, establishing supply chain due diligence system or conducting due diligence on especially long and complex supply chains beyond the first tier can be challenging, as well as collecting data on carbon footprint and its verification, and we'll hear more on that later. However, there's also an opportunity to achieve compliance by adopting recognized and common voluntary standards for supply chain due diligence, and also common methodologies for ESG data collection and measurement, and also using digital technologies to make the supply chain due diligence process more efficient and effective. And if you can turn to the next slide, please. On this slide, you can see what a supply chain due diligence management system modeled on the EU battery regulation could look like. And as you can see, it's composed of the OECD 5 steps, but it also incorporates some of the elements and requirements around the collection of supply chain data on carbon footprint and recycled content and the battery passport. And with that, I'll hand over to Ian, as I've noticed that he's giving me a heads up that my time is up.
Thanks very much, Alice. Yeah, as we can see, there's a lot going on there on the regulatory front, and thanks very much for that overview of what's happening there. With that, I would now like to hand over to the first external speaker, to Eric. Take it away, please.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ian, for the introduction, and of course, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure for me to be here today and to tell you a little bit of the, so say, Stellantis view and what we are doing and so on. I brought no slides with me today, as it's just a couple of minutes that I will share the vision and our view with you. What is very important is, it's no surprise, Stellantis is a large vehicle and automotive manufacturer. We act global, and as a global company, parts, processes, and many vehicles are in the same way global, should be interchangeable, and we want to have the global freedom and flexibility to use them kind of, wherever necessary and wherever required. And in those days, what a surprise, this becomes more and more evident. So what do we have to do? We have a multiple step approach in terms of CSR in our supply chain, because the requirements I was just telling you are in the end also then the same requirements we have towards the parts that we get supplied by our suppliers and our partners everywhere in the world, and whatever part they deliver to us, regardless if it's a small bolt or nut or if it's a large battery pack. This kind of flexibility is the same and an overarching logic. However, having said, there is a multi-step approach. Of course, talking of battery supply chains, and that's the topic of today, the battery for sure is the most, so to say, in terms of CSR relevant and most important part for us, as battery touches a lot of critical CSR points. Some of them, just to raise a few, and that's very obvious, and I'm sure many of those who join today and our competition partners in the industry have the same rules, is looking at the countries where the supply chain actors operate, the parts as such, how are they processed, how is that going to do, the raw materials that are included, and just to name a few. And these are already, and these alone are already all critical inside our battery supply chain. So it fulfills all of that. Having that said, what is really the golden standard for us to ensure that CSR is monitored and met, and we act according to the due diligence as we should? This is in the end a kind of on-site audit as the golden nugget for us, because if you do an on-site audit with either your own personnel or with a third party who's going there, you can find the best insight actually that you can get. It's just much better than just collecting paper or email messages or whatever you finally do. Going there is always the best. And here, part of this webinar today is also talking about IT. With all I've said at the beginning, and if you connect this to the slide that was just presented by Alice, you can see there is the broad flexibility that not just we want to achieve. You have all these legislations, and there will be more every day. We know that, and everything is going to develop. You have to fulfill many, many things. And this means what we are doing, carefully see what do I have to do. Of course, there are huge overlaps with all these existing legislations and regulations, and then considering the next step with battery legislations and so on and so forth, getting that all under one roof. IT is key, and IT is very, very critical, and good solutions are critical. Yes, there is a lot of stuff out there in the market, absolutely, and we know this, and yeah, I guess everybody of us is carefully looking at this, but you can never do all at the same place at the same time, and not necessarily all does fit everything. So this is the challenge I truly believe we are all currently in. For us, and guess this is not a surprise, while I'm here today, and it was also shown in an introductory slide, we are working together with RCS, because RCS currently for us, and it's not a sales show, but what RCS is currently doing is they combine the two important elements. I mentioned the golden nugget of on-site audits, going there, collecting stuff, mapping things out as the crown, so to say, of due diligence, and then IT that puts it all together, that is able to connect the dots. Because for me personally, it's quite simple. You need to turn data into information, and information can turn into knowledge. And this is the chain. And as simple as it's said, sometimes it's very tough to get this achieved. And yeah, I'm also looking at timing. I think we are already a little bit behind agenda, so I don't want to take it too much and leave enough time for the others and some Q&A. I could speak until the end of the day, but I guess that's not the aim. So having that said, I would turn it back to Ian then to continue with the agenda.
Thanks very much, Eric. Yeah, it's important to understand the different expectations of companies such as Stellantis and this complexity, and particularly in the new regulatory environment, and what seems to be an increasing number of expectations. So that's very, very interesting to hear. I would now like to hand over to Thorsten Freund to give us some information on the Battery Passport on behalf of the Global Battery Alliance. Take it away, Thorsten.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you for having me here in this webinar. So first question, can you see my screen? Did the sharing work? Okay, so would you allow me to speak a few words about Global Battery Alliance before we are coming to the Battery Passport, please? So the Global Battery Alliance has formed under the auspices of the World Economic Forum with the mission to foster a responsible and sustainable circular battery economy. Why circular? We all know that within the battery economy, the raw materials are critical, and therefore those must stay as long as possible in the loop. Moreover, the production of batteries is associated with quite a number of issues in the environmental, social, and governance field. And the Battery Passport is really that key tool which we foresee to provide the transparency and then allowing the benchmark and standard setting to compare different practices in the environmental, social, and governance criteria field, and over time monitor the progress of individual actors along the value chain. So how should a Battery Passport look like? We have many stakeholders that can be industrial actors, that can be end consumers, that can be governments or NGOs. And all those have different information requirements. As Eric rightly said, we want to turn data into knowledge and into information. Nonetheless, this requires to have understandable data, which are standardized, accurate, and can differentiate between individual procedures and practices. That must enable auditing by third parties to have an independent verification and be comprehensive to cover all ESG issues. With that said, once we are looking at a battery, that is not a single element which just comes into place once. The battery can be broken down in its individual modules, and following back the physical flows of the components of a battery, we can define indicators describing the environmental, social, and governance performance of those. And in the ESG performance set, that can be really a very comprehensive field. So we have already heard that in some cases, methodologies are missing. For example, for greenhouse gas, we have no really unambiguous piece of regulation or standard how to measure greenhouse gas, especially along value chains. Or how do we define child labor? Those are the two first examples the Global Battery Alliance is working on to develop rule books, agree those rule books with all stakeholders from industry, from governments, from non-governmental actors, and representatives of society. With that agreement, that will provide the social consensus and the social license to operate for the actors along this value chain. The access rights, of course, need to be negotiated as well, but how can this work? So once we have these unambiguous, clear standards, how we are developing the knowledge along the value chain, in the case of greenhouse gas and in the case of child labor, we need to connect the physical world with the digital world. That can happen at the level of the battery, where we create a unique identifier that can correlate a battery through a QR code, barcode, or the like, with a space in the digital world. How is now this space in the digital world filled? Once every actor has to provide data about his or her operation, like these blue little leaflets, under standardized condition, that can be tracked and traced throughout the value chain. And here, Global Battery Alliance collaborates with traceability tool providers such as RCS, but there are also others. We work together with our members such as Optel, such as Everledger, Circular, and many others. So this information is now parallel collected through the value chain, fed into the battery, combined with information about the battery at the OEM level, and the battery passport is issued. Once we have this battery passport issued, that is the information about a single battery. But then this information can interact with a platform. This platform provides the interlink to the value chain and can display back the information of the value chain to the actors who needs to know that. That has always be audited, that there's only accurate data coming in. Nonetheless, individual actors such as governments, such as NGOs, or the end consumer will receive their individual views to take their own decisions about the batteries. So why are we going this effort? The only thing what we have in our hands is to design these frameworks, how to measure data, how to generate the inputs. And by designing smartly the data acquisition and the generation of knowledge, that will then drive the insights and will drive industry and actors towards change. The ultimate outcome should be a change of state of the affairs towards a sustainable, responsible, and circular economy to develop the desired impact of a long-lasting battery economy. In a nutshell, this battery passport will be really a key tool enabling the database transparency. In the design of the mechanisms, we will already implement the motivation to change along the value chain. And these stakeholders come together to agree on the social license to operate. Not to mention, if we are really managing this, doing it together, that will be certainly the most effective, efficient, and cost-effective solution we can strive for as industry, as society, and all work together of solving the problems we have in the battery value chain. And I would like to welcome you on board working together. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that contribution, Thorsten. I know there's a lot to unpack on the battery passport. It's an impressive undertaking for a very complex set of problems. So thank you very much for that contribution. I look forward to some questions on that. I would now like to hand over to Robert Pell from Enviro. Please take it away.
Thanks very much, Ian, and really interesting presentations and relevant to what I'm going to discuss. So first, I'll introduce Enviro and myself. So yeah, my name is Robert Pell, founder and CEO of Enviro. And what Enviro does is we quantify the environmental impact of products and processes with a real focus in the battery materials value chain and with batteries themselves. So we've worked with over 100 commercial LCA projects in the battery material value chain. And I suppose one of our most relevant and high profile recent projects was working with Tesla on their impact report, looking at applying life cycle assessment to their battery material value chain and looking at hotspot analysis to see where their big impact contributors were. So I think what's really important, and what we've heard from the previous discussions today, is the key importance of good quality inventory data, so input data into these models, because we can create the methodologies and we can create the most complex and high quality digital models, but garbage in equals garbage out. So we have to ensure that we have very high quality inventory data going into these models right across the value chain, whether that's at a mine site or whether that's in the cell manufacturing facility. And I think that's really a point where RCS can add significant value when you're, as Eric said at the beginning as well, it's not just accepting data that might be provided, it's really doing high quality audit work to do QA and QC on the data that's going into these models. So it was very interesting as well hearing about the global battery passport and the work that Thorsten and his team and many collaborators are doing on harmonizing the methodology. This is also really important from our perspective. Enviro has had this as a key theme within our company. We've been leading with the creation of product category rules for particular materials such as graphite, rare earths, and lithium. And this is to ensure that there's a harmonized approach, a consistent methodology to quantifying impact. I think one point that I wanted to mention as well is there's a lot of talk and focus on greenhouse gas emissions. The approach of life cycle assessment allows you to consider a whole range of environmental impacts. And I think that'll be interesting to see how the guidelines and rules change within the EU, because I know that they were referring to, say, greenhouse gas emissions, but under the product environmental footprint method, which is also a development within the EU, you would include 16 impact categories. And these can include things such as water-related impacts in your supply chain, land use-related impacts in your supply chain, as well as more abstract things such as human toxicity or ecotoxicity. But something that's really important as we move forward is that we're not just having a single focus on one impact category and not considering, say, impact or burden shifting across impact categories or across parts of the supply chain. So I think that's a really important step in the next few years, is to improve the methodology for the climate change impact category, but make sure that we don't just stop there, but increase the what is included in these impact categories. So for a bit of context, I'll give you an example of the type of work that Minviro does within the battery material supply chain, or from the context of a life cycle assessment of a battery cell. So we have a lot of primary data that we've collected and modeled for various production routes, whether that's the value chain for lithium hydroxide production or nickel sulfate production. We're able to then build out these models from mine right through to refinery, through to cathode manufacturing, cell manufacturing. And we can support companies in understanding exactly where those environmental hotspots are, whether that's in a nickel refinery process or whether that's in a cell manufacturing process. And this is a very important step, because at the moment we are, I suppose, very early on the journey in terms of primary data collection across the whole material value chain. And so by providing this hotspot analysis, we can identify the priority locations to collect this primary data. It also allows us to focus on which parts of the supply chain we can mitigate impacts for. So if it is a hotspot across a battery in terms of a nickel refinery, are there innovations in technology or processes that could bring this impact down and make the biggest impact across the battery material value chain? And I think the final thing that I wanted to mention is just, how our work aligns with these regulation developments. So obviously this area is very dynamic. We have the Global Battery Passport. We're part of the Recharge group, which is looking at creating the product environmental footprint category rules. And there is a harmonization among those two groups. And I'm hoping in the coming years that we'll get these methodologies and documents complete and in public hands, so we can clearly and robustly carry out environmental life cycle assessments and in confidence that everyone is using the same methodology. Because at the end of the day, what we want to do is make sure there's transparency, consistency, and scientifically robust approaches to quantifying environmental impact. And then that should just be the start of the journey. Once we have these full supply chains mapped in terms of environmental impact, we can really focus on how we can bring down these impacts as well. So thanks. I'll pass it back to Ian.
Yeah, an absolutely key part of how we see what the regulations are requiring of us, and two, not only the regulatory bodies, but also a broad array of stakeholders are increasingly demanding and expecting high quality environmental data. So with that, I would like to hand over to myself as the next speaker on behalf of RCS Global's Digital Solutions team. Next slide, please. So I want to briefly touch on the different aspects of digitization, digitalization, and indeed digital transformation. We've seen, and I believe it's pretty clear from the previous contributions, that there are many expectations about what can be improved, what transparency is required in these battery supply chains. However, the supply chain complexity is a core challenge to organizations that want to improve transparency and ensure that responsible sourcing is occurring. The supply chain complexity obscures risks in supply chains, and it also means that it's very hard and, in fact, resource intensive for individual organizations to engage with sub-suppliers, assess performance, measure that performance, document it, and then communicate and report on this. So we suggest, beginning by digitizing your suppliers and your supply chain information. Then through a process of digitalization of your systems and processes, you can start to evolve in the way that you're able to work more effectively, to have data-driven approaches to prioritization and risk management. And eventually this leads to a process of transformation in terms of the whole way that the organization is able to conduct responsible sourcing. And where it gets particularly interesting at this end of the spectrum is thinking about this inter-organization collaboration, data sharing, as alluded to by Thorsten in his presentation. Next slide, please. We'd just like to very briefly introduce RCS Global's Vine platform. Our Vine platform is the result of about 15 years of experience in responsible sourcing, and it's designed to support companies in their efforts to digitalize and in fact digitally enable and then transform their responsible sourcing practices. I would be able to talk about this forever, but I would encourage participants in the webinar to go to our website after this, and there you can find a lot more information on the platform itself. In a nutshell, it contains nearly 1,000 discovered and validated suppliers in the battery raw material ecosystem. It gives users the ability to create and map your own battery supply chains, as well as organizing modules that allow you to filter suppliers in their performance against ESG criteria, such as environmental certification or perhaps OECD conformance. And with analytics allows you to sort of see who is performing well and where you have areas of risk in your supply chains. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, Vine is built on the leading audits and other experience that RCS has gathered over the preceding years in different raw material supply chains, and with a major focus on the battery raw materials. After launching Vine 1.0 in the first half of this year, we're very excited to be a technical implementation partner of the Global Battery Alliance that Thorsten kindly presented, and working with other parties and partners in the track and trace working group on developing and demonstrating a technical proof of concept in the second half of this year. So presently we're focusing on a foundational battery passport enablement within Vine and that technical proof of concept. So we are currently onboarding pilot participants, and in this context, I'm very happy to announce that we'll be cooperating and collaborating closely with Minviro, with Rob and his team, to incorporate high quality lifecycle inventory and lifecycle assessment data into the battery passport data that we are able to pass through the supply chain on Vine. And then moving towards the end of the year, we look forward to demonstrating this battery passport capability by actually gathering real data, be that LCA or child labor indicators, human rights indicators, responsible sourcing against OECD, in accordance with the GBA's rule books. So final slide, please. So here we've got some indication of how that battery passport might be conceived of within the platform. But in a nutshell, our approach to transparency has meant that we have gone for a broad ecosystem approach to identify the different network components. And this puts us in a strong position to actually help deliver a version of the battery passport. So on Vine, we've established that transparency, and now it's about reaching down throughout individual supply chains, working on a roll-up capability, coupling high quality environmental emissions data with human rights and social sustainability indicators, and passing this up through the known supply chains to attach this in the form of a QR code as previously introduced to an individual battery. So yeah, we think that we're in a strong position to deliver this, and we are very much looking forward to entering the piloting phase. And we would also just like to put out there that we would welcome further pilot partners. So if you are interested and indeed an organization in the battery ecosystem, then we'd like to hear from you. Now, with that, a little bit behind time, but not completely surprising given the complexity of the topics each of our speakers was talking to, I'd like to hand back to Alice.
Thank you, Ian. So we'll now begin the Q&A session. And as was mentioned by Ian earlier, if you have a question, please type it in to the Q&A field. And if we don't have the time to answer your question today, we can also provide you with follow-up clarification. So I'll take the first question, which has come in, and I will address it to Eric because I think that's he's in the most appropriate position to answer it. So how do you approach due diligence in high-risk areas such as cobalt production in the DRC with low-quality data and weak governance? And what are the best tools for sourcing raw materials responsibly from high-risk areas? And what are some of the challenges that you encounter in the process?
Yeah, thanks very much. It's a very good question. Actually, that's a couple of questions in one big umbrella, and it's not so easy to answer. However, let's kind of sort it a little bit. I mean, I mentioned earlier, and we heard this, that having solid data and solid information is really key. It's tough. Back to the golden standard. We try to gain as much as possible knowledge, information via audits and with firms like RCS to gain maximum knowledge inside the DRC, if that's possible or within the possibilities. And then based on this gathered knowledge, we try to make the best possible decisions, because nobody of us is able to predict the future. That's impossible. Yeah, and we never know exactly how all the deep supply chains will be. But this is in our opinion, best that can be done, is going there as much as possible, connecting the dots as much as possible, and the established connections that are already available. Again, DRC is a great example. To understand them, is that something that is reliable? And in terms of CSR, is that, I mean, can we live with that, or is that not okay? And then based on this knowledge, place future decisions and do the right thing. Yeah. I hope this answers it in some way. And yeah, maybe Ian, you can also contribute to this. So I see your hand is raising.
Yeah, sure. And as you rightly say, Eric, there's kind of a number of questions with that question there, but it's an important one. Yeah, you have to have answers to the most difficult questions, otherwise it's not really due diligence. And just to kind of add to what Eric's been saying, I wanted to highlight that there are also on the ground programs, right, in these geographies. So for example, RCS Global runs a better mining program in the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example, in which we have trained monitors actually day in, day out, generating independent observed data on incidents and generating, for example, corrective action plans on some of these more difficult, let's say, geographies. So there are increasing initiatives, and indeed we run one of them quite successfully. It's now scaled to, I think, 50 artisanal mine sites, and would encourage you, if you're interested in this, to reach out to us outside of the webinar to get more information on the Better Mining program. But as Eric mentioned, the key is data quality. So to actually understand what's happening there as best as possible to capture that. And then, however, just capturing this information is not enough. It actually has to be, something has to happen as a result of it. So it's about converting data, as Eric said, into information, and with that information, using it to have preferably a positive impact. And that's something I'd like to see sort of included in a future battery passport, is that indeed these artisanal miners and other, less developed geographies also are not excluded from, but are indeed included in in a battery passport or other technological solutions.
And if I may, Ian, let me add one more thing that is probably even more basic than I was mentioning and you were mentioning. The solution is not banning or not looking at DRC at all. This is not a solution, because this would mean, okay, we don't care at all. We look into other areas, into other solutions, and we just completely ban it. Because if we would do this, we would also somehow close our eyes and would stop the development, which is so important. And this is what we also keep telling to our suppliers is we must do the right thing for sure. And there are no excuses, but we also think and truly believe in the development and working together and bringing things forward. And this can only be done if we keep our eyes open and also work with these players, for example, in the DRC. Just this, wanted to add this as well.
Great, thank you, Eric. And speaking of inclusiveness and improving practices, I have a question for Torsten. How does the GBA foresee the Battery Passport initiative being inclusive and rewarding the improvement in practices? And this is particularly thinking about the millions of artisanal miners that are working in battery value chains.
Yeah, this again, it's not an easy question to a complex issue. And let's look at it from different angles. So one, if we are speaking about Battery Passport, there's this picture in our minds that says one battery, one passport. If we now speak about driving change, we need to look at the entire Battery Passport ecosystem, the whole program. So that we are extracting information out of the individual battery passports, that we are comparing that information and identifying the hotspots. And once you know where the hotspots are, you can take action. You go down to the ground and change the conditions on the ground. It is, I can remember one very key learning I had during my times when talking about quality assurance in production. One of those who have taught me said, Torsten, you cannot measure quality, you have to produce it. And this is really the same story here. You cannot measure compliance, you need to go really down to the ground and drive the change locally. And there is no law of nature which is forbidding to produce cobalt without child labor. We just need to find the mechanisms how we can help those local societies to make their living without unacceptable practices.
Great, thank you, Torsten. That was very insightful. So I'll go back to the point that was mentioned earlier around the quality of the ESG data that's being collected on the supply chain. And I have a question for Robert, which is how important is it to get on-site verification of GHG emissions or carbon footprint calculations, essentially to verify that they're accurate?
Yeah, I think it's almost an identical point to say, you know, the ability to collect good quality primary data from artisanal mines. You need that at large operators as well. And this is, you know, if you are doing desk-based studies and you're accepting sort of maybe assumptions from the operator themselves, then you have to assign that data with a lower data quality because you don't have that third-party validation. And I imagine within the global battery passport and I know that within the PEFCR, you'll have a data quality indicator. And so if you don't have this primary data quality, primary data collection, the data quality of your final battery impact will be low and it's not worth as much. So that primary data collection is essential. And I think we're going to see more and more of it over the coming years.
Thank you. Ian, do you have anything to add on this?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Rob is much more the expert on the matter, but I think we've seen that for quite some time, sort of generalist databases have been employed in the area of emissions, you know, whether looking at the different scope requirements. And I would just be interested in, with a sort of a follow-up question to Rob on, you know, why these databases perhaps no longer suffice, and where you see the reasons for that, and what the solution is to it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we're obviously moving in the trajectory of low resolution to high resolution process route specific data. That's important for two main reasons. One, the industry average, or the data point, the one data point for, say, lithium hydroxide production that would be in the database, would not reflect the reality of all the different production routes. The prime example is lithium hydroxide monohydrate production from brines versus spodumene when it's converted in China can be 16 kilograms for the Australian spodumene per kilogram and around 3 or 4 per kilogram from brines. So that's a significant range in impact for what equates to the same product. If you're using an average database value, it doesn't allow the end user to understand what good decisions in supply chains are and what are not. So that's super important, and that's true with every single material that's entering the battery. So it's really important that we do get primary production route specific data rather than just relying on industry average data points.
Perfect, thank you. Oh, go ahead, please, Torsten.
Yeah, and maybe I directly can add on that. It's not enough just to look retrospectively, which are the better and the worse producers in terms of CO2 footprint. It's even has a predictive character. Once we are choosing new projects, opening new mines, you can predict what would be the carbon footprint of that specific mine, and you can choose, do I open the mine in this location or in another location or a completely different one? That really gives companies and economic actors additional parameters to choose the most useful projects for supplying battery materials with the objective to reduce carbon footprint overall. And that's the information we really need to live on.
It's a really good point. I should maybe respond to that as well. So that's, you can get really quite technical into this. We published a paper in Nature Earth and Environment Reviews, which was looking at exactly at this. You use data from current operations, and you go right down to what is the mineralogy of the deposit, and how can you optimize the impact, so to reduce the environmental impact for these future projects. Do you change your exploration strategies to make sure you're spending more money on exploring for these low impact deposit types? Obviously, we're going quite into the realms of geology, which is my background, which might not be so relevant for this talk, but yeah, it's super interesting.
Thank you, that was very insightful. I'd like to bring the discussion back to sort of the overall responsible sourcing approach and supply chain due diligence process. And I would like to ask Eric, what are some of the achievements that Stellantis has achieved in the last 5 years when it comes to your responsible sourcing program, which you outlined earlier? And what are you most proud of?
Yeah, I mean, very strictly, I would have to say 5 years, Stellantis is 1.5 years old. So strictly spoken, I cannot speak that long in the past because, as you know, we are newly found. But something we are very proud of course, is generically that we declared to become carbon neutral by 2038 as a car manufacturer. That is pretty challenging and pretty early. And this, of course, gets in particular role to our supply chain, to all our suppliers, so they get aggressive targets. We work with them very intensively to get these down. And with this industrial pressure, the pressure from us, we really see momentum that the actual numbers go down. And back to my golden standard, we have just intensified our on-site audit program quite largely. And here we see really the impact on the ground, because we do a very close follow-up, very close due diligence on this, and we really see, okay, if we explore issues, whatever they are, and they are very various, we really follow up, and then we see the pictures. Sometimes we even go there again, and we see how things really develop on the ground. I mean, these are just examples. We don't do this with every supplier, obviously, but we have a pretty robust and pretty good risk identification system to pick the right candidates and then doing the right things. And this is definitely something we are very, very happy for and very proud of, because here we really see the actual impacts on all kinds of CSR issues. And we believe that this is powerful because this is something that is gaining impact on the ground with people that you can in the end ask, did something improve? And they can say yes. And that's great. Other than that, we publish that we work, it's not RCS, but also together with EcoVadis, and we see numbers, digits in performance increasing year over year, almost steadily. And this makes us proud because we are pretty much top notch in terms of all participants there.
Thank you, Eric. So I'm conscious of the time, and we have something like 2 minutes left, and I know Torsten has to leave on the hour. So my last question will be directed to him. So what would you say to those who say that the Battery Passport is another Western or European initiative? And how does the GBA ensure that there's broad participation in the initiative, particularly from Asian stakeholders?
Well, that depends on who is on board. So we are collaborator or member of the GBA's EV100 initiative from China. We have Chinese companies, and last week I spoke at the European Battery Show in Stuttgart, and a recycler from China Battery was actively inquiring as a co-panelist, hey, can we join GBA? So there is interest. Moreover, we have lithium producers from South America, from Australia in our network. We have US companies in the network. So this is really a global initiative. And global is the one perspective, or the geographic perspective is one perspective, but also having stakeholders from all different segments of society, not only industry, but also representatives of civil society, voices of governments, academia, thought leaders, and all those together can agree on common standard, which is accepted by all of driving change. So if you don't debate about the data, you can debate about the impact and how to drive impact.
Thanks very much for that, Torsten. And yeah, looking forward to seeing progress, increasing membership and increasing participation, just as important, in the Battery Passport project. So with that, I would like to say a heartfelt thanks to our excellent panelists. As you could see, I think we could have had a conversation for quite some more time, but such is life in these exciting times. And I would also like to thank all of the attendees for joining us for this webinar. And I would just like to point out that this webinar has been recorded and will be made available online. So yeah, there was a question about having access to some of the content, so keep an eye out for that. And with that, I would like to conclude the webinar and thank you all very much for your interest and for attending.